Welcome to another tutor short provided by the Educational Support Services Department of Lehigh Carbon Community College, which is in Schnecksville, Pennsylvania, just outside of Allentown. These videos review key learnings from our science courses here at LTRI-C, and please remember that the Educational Support Services Department does provide walk-in tutoring. This video will review Newton's third law. And that law states that whenever one object exerts a force on a second object, the second object exerts an equal force in the opposite direction of the first. And that's kind of represented by this equation. If you have a force of action, then there's an equal and opposite force of reaction from the at that point of contact also. So the first thing to keep track of when you're dealing with Newton's third law is that there's action and reaction pairs. So a typical problem is you have a nail and you're going to hit it with a hammer. Let's call this a hammer here. And so there will be a point of contact right here. But what's important to remember is the nail feels the force of the hammer. The hammer is causing the action. So you would represent that the nail is feeling the force of the action of the hammer coming in and hitting it. But because the nail is there and it's going to resist movement, the hammer, you would say, feels the force of the reaction of the nail. You're hitting the nail in an action. The nail hits back, if you want to say, with a reaction. And they're going to be an equal and opposite force. So think about pairs whenever you're dealing with this. One object is causing the action, the other object is going to cause a reaction. The second part of Newton's third law that's important to remember is that these action and reaction forces are equal. And so I use here as an example of a person pushing a rock. And that person is applying a force of 10 newtons. And the friction force that's going to resist that is only 8 newtons. And so because the sum of the forces are not equal to 0, we end up with an overall force of 2 newtons for the rock, and that rock is now going to move. And so that 2 Newton force is going to result in acceleration of that block. So when we talk about that 2 newtons in the acceleration of the rock, that's a second law problem. But the third law problem gets involved when we think about right over here. This is that point of contact that we mentioned was important. At that point of contact, we have the block here. This is your point of contact. Okay. The force of action is 10 newtons. So right here I am applying a force of action of 10 newtons. And that's what the block feels. Okay, so the block is feeling a force of action of 10 newtons. But the block is pushing back at 10 newtons. And so the person is feeling that force of reaction of 10 newtons. So even though the block is moving and you're overcoming the 8 newtons of friction and the block is moving based on that extra 2 newtons of force that you're applying, you are feeling back. The reaction force that you're feeling is 10 newtons. And the way to rationalize that sometimes in your head, what I like to think about is a bowl of jelly. If this rock that I'm pushing was not pushing back at 10 newtons, if it was a bowl of jelly where it couldn't give me a pushback of 10 newtons, what would happen is my hands, I use green here, this force of action I make would push me inside the jello. and I wouldn't be able to apply 10 newtons of force onto that bowl of jelly because it just can't push back at 10 newtons. And so that would be a very different problem. But the way I set this up, I said, no, this block can push me back at 10 newtons, and it does, and therefore my overall sum, if I look at my sum of my forces, I end up with an extra 2 newtons, which is going to move the block to the left in this case. So you have to think about those forces have to be equal, and if they're not, then whoever's pushing is going to go inside that material, that object. The final point I want to make about Newton's third law is that these action and reaction forces we've talked about, they work on different objects. So you have to treat these forces separately when you're working a problem. Again, when we talk about the hammer and the nail, all right, so I had a hammer over here coming in and hitting the nail. We said the nail is going to feel that force of action, and that the hammer is going to feel the force of reaction. Now, when you solve a problem, you would do a free body diagram, but you would do it separately. You would do one around the nail, and the nail, if you think about it, is only feeling this force of the hammer. The nail itself is not feeling that reaction force of its pushing back. Who feels that is the hammer. So the hammer, when you do a free body diagram of the hammer over here, it feels that force, assuming it's 10 Newton, but anyway, it feels the force of reaction from the nail. But neither object here feels both forces at the point of contact. You're going to break them into two different free body diagrams and resolve them separately. And so don't make the mistake of applying the action and reaction force both to the same body, because that is not how it works. And so that'll also help you work your homework problems, keeping those separately as you do your free body diagram. Thank you.